Elias Calloway heard the pounding at 3 in the morning and didn't move. He'd heard wind before. He'd heard coyotes, cattle, the crack of timber splitting in the cold. He'd heard things in this house at 3 in the morning that had no explanation and didn't deserve one. But he had never heard a child scream like that. Raw, cracking, bottomless.
"Please, my sisters are dying. Somebody, please, please!"
He was across the room before he decided to move. If this story reaches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the very end. Drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means everything to us. Now let's go back to that door, and the night that changed 2 broken people forever. The boy hit the floor the moment Elias pulled it open. Not fell, hit. Face first, full weight, the way a person drops when the last thing holding them upright disappears. Elias caught him by the back of the coat. A man's coat, canvas and wool, 3 sizes too large. The sleeves hanging past the boy's hands so that his fingers had been invisible inside them the whole walk over. Which meant his hands had been bare against the wind. Which meant the boy had walked however far he'd walked, with no protection at all. Elias flipped him over. 12 years old, maybe. Gray eyes, half open. Lips the color of a sky before a killing frost. The particular blue-white that Elias had seen before, on cattle, on men who'd gotten turned around in a whiteout, on his son Thomas the morning they found him. And he stopped that thought where it stood and buried it the same way he'd buried everything else. "Boy," he slapped the boy's cheek lightly. "Look at me, right here." The eyes focused. Slow, then fast, like a fire catching. "My family." The voice was barely air. "The Granger lean-to, east of your fence. My ma, she gave her coat to Lily, and she can't—" And Lily stopped shaking about 20 minutes ago. And when they stopped shaking, I know what it means. Elias was already moving. Blanket off the chair, wrapped around the boy, jar of water from the shelf, tipped to his mouth. "Drink. All of it." The boy drank with hands that shook so badly, Elias had to hold the jar steady. But his eyes stayed open. That was something. "How many people in that lean-to?" "Mama, my brother Caleb, he's 7, my sister Nora, 10. A pause, ragged at the edges. "And Lily, she's 5. She had a fever 2 days ago and she's—" "Get up!" The boy blinked. "Sir?" "Can you walk?" He watched the boy process the question, watched something shift behind those gray eyes. Not hope exactly. More like the recalculation of a person who has been running on nothing but forward motion and just found out forward was still an option. The boy grabbed the door frame and hauled himself upright. His legs shook. He held. "Yes, sir." "Then let's go." The storm came at them sideways the moment they stepped off the porch. Elias had lived in Montana Territory for 22 years, and he still felt that cold like a personal insult. The kind of wind that didn't just take your warmth, it took your confidence, your sense of direction, your certainty that the ground under your boots was going to stay where you put it. He bent into it and walked. The boy walked beside him. Head down, arms locked over his chest, each step deliberate, the way steps are deliberate when your legs stop trusting themselves about a mile back. "Your name," Elias said. "Henry." A beat. "Henry Hayes." "How far'd you walk to reach my door, Henry Hayes?" Silence for a few steps. "However far it was," Henry said. Elias looked at him sideways. The boy was staring straight ahead at nothing, jaw set, The kind of expression that had stopped being bravery about halfway through whatever it had cost to get here, and turned into something harder and less voluntary. He didn't ask again. He smelled the lean-to before he saw it. Dead fire, wet canvas, the specific cold smell of a space where the heat had given out hours ago, and the walls had absorbed it. He pushed through the canvas flap and stopped. The woman was on the ground, with 3 children wrapped around her like she was the last warm thing in the world. She'd taken off her coat, her only coat, and wrapped it around the smallest one, the little girl with yellow curls plastered flat against her forehead. She held the child against her chest, with arms gone rigid, not from cold alone, but from hours of refusing to let go. Behind her, a dark-haired girl of about 10 had both arms wrapped around her mother's waist, pressing her own body heat in, and tucked under the woman's chin, deep asleep or something too close to it. A small boy with yellow hair and round cheeks held a thin yellow dog against his chest with both arms. The dog's nose buried in the boy's collar, like it understood the assignment. On the ground beside the little girl with yellow curls was a cloth doll, small, handmade. One button eye missing, dress stitched from what looked like a piece of faded blue fabric. The little girl's hand was curled around it, even in the cold, even now. Fingers locked, like even unconscious, she knew to hold on. The woman looked up. Her eyes were blue-green, and they hit Elias like a fist. Not with weakness, with the opposite. The kind of eyes that had been keeping watch for so long that alertness had stopped being a choice and become a permanent condition. She looked at him the way a person looks at a threat they've already decided how to handle. "Get away from my children." Her voice was flat, certain. The voice of a woman who had used those exact words before and meant them every time. "Mama," Henry stepped in behind Elias. "He's got a fire. Real walls. Please." "Henry, behind me." "Mrs. Hayes." Elias didn't step forward. Both hands open, palms out. An old habit from years of approaching men who had reasons to be dangerous. "Your youngest. She's hypothermic. Her shivering stopped." "I know." "Then you know the window." "I know the window." Her jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like wire beneath the skin. "I also know I don't have any reason to trust a man I've never met who shows up in the middle of a blizzard offering help." "You're right," Elias said. "You don't." That stopped her. He could see it. She'd been ready for an argument, had her counter already loaded, and he'd pulled the ground out from under it. "What do you want?" she said. "Nothing." "Men don't help for nothing." "Most don't," Elias said. "I had a son, 5 years old. He died in a storm like this one, and I was 20 miles away, chasing a man who wasn't worth the boots he wore. So when your boy knocked on my door and told me his sisters were dying," he stopped, let it sit. "I didn't think about what you had to offer. I just got my coat." The dark-haired girl, Nora, was watching him from behind her mother's shoulder. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but her eyes were tracking everything. His hands, his face, the distance between him and Lily. Cataloging. Deciding something at a pace too slow and careful to call trust, and too methodical to call fear. The woman, Dorothy, though he didn't know it yet, looked at Lily. The little girl's lips were still that wrong color. Her chest moved, shallow, too shallow, and in her locked fingers the cloth doll sat crooked, one remaining button eye staring up at nothing. Dorothy looked back at Elias. The war lasted 3 more seconds. "Nora," she said quietly, "help me up." Nora rose without a word and put her shoulder under her mother's arm, but she didn't take her eyes off Elias, not for a second. Elias reached for Lily, Dorothy's hand snapped out. "I'll carry her." "You can barely stand." "I said I'll carry her." Her voice cracked on the last word. Not weakness, the crack that comes from something held too tight for too long. "She's mine. I carry her." Elias stepped back. Dorothy got Lily up with Nora's help, pulling the little girl against her chest, pressing her lips to the yellow curls and holding them there for 1 second. Not a kiss, something more necessary than that. Something that was about reminding both of them that the other one was still there. Then she straightened. "Lead," she said to Elias. He turned and walked. Behind him, he heard Caleb wake up. A small, startled sound. Then the dog's nails on the frozen ground, and Henry's voice, low and steady. "Come on, Cal. Stay close to me." The boy hadn't been given that instruction. He'd given it to himself, or he'd inherited it from somewhere, and either way, he'd been carrying it for long enough that it came out of him automatically, the way breathing comes out automatically. They moved through the blizzard in a line. Elias first, Dorothy and Lily behind him, Nora at Dorothy's side, one hand on her mother's arm. Henry at the back, with Caleb pressed against him, and the dog at their heels. Nobody spoke. The wind was too loud for it, and the distance too short for anything worth saying. Inside, Elias went straight to the hearth. He built the fire up fast. The dry oak he'd split in September and stored on the right side, the good wood, the stuff he'd kept preparing out of habit after the reason for preparing it was gone. It caught in under a minute and threw heat into the room like it had been waiting. Dorothy laid Lily on the rug in front of it before she'd fully lowered herself to her knees, settling her daughter in the warmth with the careful precision of someone who has been the only doctor their children have ever had. She pulled off Lily's boots, checked the fingers, pressed the back of her hand to the little girl's cheek, and held it there, counting something internally, running some calculation that only she knew the variables of. "Nora," she said, "hands, don't stop." Nora sat cross-legged beside her sister and wrapped both her hands around Lily's and held them between her own. She looked at her mother, not at Elias, taking her instruction from the right source. Caleb stood in the middle of the room and looked at the ceiling, not at anything on the ceiling, just at the ceiling, at the fact of it, solid, unmoving, not rattling or rippling in the wind. He was 7 years old, and Elias could see him trying to remember if rooms had always been this way, or if he'd just forgotten. "Mister," Caleb said. "Caleb," Dorothy said. "Do you got food?" "Caleb." "It's a fair question," Elias said. He crossed to the shelf without looking at Dorothy and came back with hard biscuits, dried venison, a jar of preserved peaches he'd put up in August, when he still did things like put up preserves, because the doing of it kept his hands occupied. He set it on the floor in front of Caleb. "Eat slow. Your stomach won't thank you if you hurry." Caleb looked at his mother. Dorothy watched Elias for 1 more second with those measuring eyes. Then she gave the smallest nod. Caleb sat down and ate with both hands, and fed pieces of venison to the dog between every other bite. The dog's name was Biscuit. Caleb reported this between mouthfuls, as though it were important information Elias would need. Elias told him he was glad to know it. Henry stood near the door, still in the coat, still not sitting, still not eating. He'd moved once since they came inside, to position himself at an angle where he could see the door and see Elias at the same time. Elias noticed and said nothing about it. "Son," he kept his voice level, "sit down." "I'm standing." "You walked God knows how far in below zero cold in bare hands. Sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine." "You were hypothermic." "I said I'm fine." Henry's voice came out harder than he probably intended, with an edge that had nothing to do with Elias, and everything to do with a weight that had been cutting into his shoulders for a long time. He caught himself, pulled it back. "Sir," he added, quieter, as though remembering his manners and resenting that he had to. Elias looked at this boy in a dead man's coat and recognized the anger inside the exhaustion. Not directed at Elias, not really directed at anything specific. Just the anger of a 12-year-old who had been asked to carry the weight of a grown man and had been doing it, and was so tired of it he could barely see straight, but couldn't put it down because there was nobody else to pick it up. He didn't push. "There's a chair by the window," Elias said. "You don't have to sleep in it. Just put your back against something solid for a while." Henry looked at the chair. Something crossed his face, something that might have been the beginning of relief, before he decided not to let it be. He walked to the chair and sat down and folded his arms over his chest and kept his eyes on the room. Across the floor, something shifted. A small sound from the rug in front of the fire. Then a voice. Thin, thread-like, but real.
"Mama."
Dorothy's hands froze on Lily's arms.
"Right here, baby."
She leaned down immediately, face close to her daughter's. "Right here. I'm right here." Lily's eyes opened. They were brown, large, glassy, with the particular confusion of a child who has been very cold for a very long time and is only now remembering that warmth exists. She looked at her mother. Then she looked around the room, at the fire, at Nora, at Caleb and the dog, at Henry in the chair, at the ceiling that didn't move. Her hand tightened around the cloth doll. "Is Sunday warm?" she whispered. Dorothy let out a breath that had been held so long it shook on the way out. "Sunday's warm," she said. "You're both warm. You're both going to be just fine." Lily looked at the doll. Then she looked at Elias. She studied him the way children study things they're trying to fit into a category. Patient, unfiltered, with no performance of politeness to get in the way of the actual looking. "You have a sad face," she said. "Lily," Dorothy said. "He does, Mama." "It's a sad face, but it's not a mean face." She looked at Elias another moment. "Papa had a sad face sometimes, after work, but he always smiled when he saw us." The room went very quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a space when something true has been said, and everyone in the room knows it, and nobody knows what to do with it yet. Elias said nothing. He turned and went to the kitchen shelf and poured a cup of water and set it near Dorothy without looking at her. She didn't thank him, but she picked it up. Nora watched all of this from her place beside Lily. She'd been watching all of it, every movement, every exchange, every choice Elias had made since they walked through the door. Elias had the feeling that very little was escaping into that dark-haired girl's assessment, and very little was being decided quickly. He respected that. He didn't say so. After a while, Dorothy looked up from Lily and said, "I'm Dorothy Hayes. These are Henry, Nora, Caleb, and Lily." "Elias Calloway." "Your land." "Mine." "We didn't know—" "Mrs. Hayes." He cut it off quietly. "You don't owe me an explanation tonight." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away for a long moment. Not confrontation, more like two people who have each learned to read strangers fast and are doing it now, checking results against each other. "You can take the back room," Elias said. "All of you. I'll stay out here." "We're not putting you out of your own bedroom." "You're not putting me anywhere. I sleep in this chair most nights anyway." He moved to the woodpile and began stacking more fuel near the hearth, his back to her, giving her the space to decide without feeling watched. "Storm won't break before morning. There's no sense arguing about it." Dorothy was quiet for a long time. He could feel her running through her options, the same way he imagined she'd been running through options for months, accounting for every variable, every risk, every way a situation that seemed safe could stop being safe. The habit of a woman who had learned that the worst things usually arrived wearing the face of something reasonable. "How long have you lived here alone?" she said finally. He stacked another piece of wood. 4 years. "Since your son?" "Since my son." She said nothing to that. He didn't expect her to. There's nothing to say to that except, "I'm sorry." And they'd both been through enough to know that "I'm sorry" doesn't move anything. From the chair by the window, Henry's voice came, quieter than before. Still not soft. Henry Hayes didn't seem to own soft. But the edge had worn down by a few degrees. "Mr. Calloway." Elias turned. The boy was looking at the fire, not at Elias. His arms were still crossed over his chest, the dead man's coat still too wide at the shoulders, the sleeves still too long, still swallowing his hands. "My pa wore that coat," Henry said, "before he died. He wore it every winter." He stopped, swallowed. "I know it's too big. Mama says I'll grow into it." Another stop. Something behind his eyes that he was deciding whether to show. I wanted you to know it's not because we're poor that it doesn't fit. It was his. That's why." Elias looked at this boy, at the coat that was simultaneously armor and wound, the only piece of the man left that Henry could put on and walk around in. "Your pa had good taste in coats," Elias said. Henry looked at him then, fast, involuntary, the look of someone who didn't expect to be met where they were. Then he looked back at the fire. "Yeah," he said. "He did." The fire crackled. Lily had closed her eyes again, still holding Sunday. Her color better now, her breathing evening out into something that sounded like real sleep instead of the absence of consciousness. Dorothy's hand moved slowly through her daughter's yellow curls, the same repetitive motion over and over, the gesture of a woman soothing herself as much as the child. Nora had leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, without seeming to notice she'd done it. Her eyes were closed, but Elias didn't think she was sleeping. She was too still for sleep. She was listening. Caleb had stretched out on the rug with Biscuit across his feet and was conducting a quiet, half-conscious conversation with the dog about the room, the fire, the biscuits, the man who lived here who seemed okay so far. "He's got a lot of wood, Biscuit," Caleb murmured. "That's a good sign. Papa always said you can tell a man by his woodpile." Elias sat down in the chair across from Henry. He picked up the cold cup of coffee he had abandoned before any of this started. He held it in both hands and looked at the fire. Outside, the blizzard pushed against the shutters with the voice of something that hadn't finished being terrible yet. The walls held. The fire held. The room was warm. A few minutes passed. Then Caleb's voice, lower now, right at the edge of sleep. "Biscuit, we got inside. I told you we would." A long pause, the slow punctuation of a child losing the fight with exhaustion. "I told you if we kept moving, God would put us somewhere warm." Then, barely sound at all, "I think he put us at the right door this time." Elias sat very still. His hand, wrapped around the cup, tightened slowly. Not from cold. The coffee had been cold for hours. Across the room, Dorothy looked up from Lily and looked at Elias. She'd heard it. She watched his face for a moment, not reading threat, something different, something more careful, like she was looking at a door and trying to decide if it was worth knocking. He looked back at the fire. 4 years. 4 years he had sat in this chair, and the house had been the quietest place in Montana Territory. And he had wanted it that way, have engineered it that way, had kept every living thing at a distance except the cattle and his horse, because cattle and horses required care, without requiring anything that resembled being known. 4 years, and now there were 4 children sleeping by his fire, and a woman watching him from across the room with eyes that hadn't decided what he was yet. And a boy, in a dead man's coat, sitting in the chair by the window, finally asleep. And a yellow dog snoring softly on his floor. Elias Calloway looked at all of it and could not explain, not to God, not to the memory of Margaret, not to the silence that had been his only companion for 4 years, why the house that had been a tomb since the winter of 1879 felt, for the first time in all that time, like it was breathing again. Dorothy Hayes did not sleep. She lay in the back room with all 4 children pressed around her. Lily on her left, Caleb on her right with Biscuit wedged between him and the wall, Nora curled at her back, and Henry on the outside with his face toward the door. And she stared at the ceiling and listened to the storm and ran through every decision she'd made in the last 6 months, looking for the one that had brought them here. She always ended up at the same place. Not a decision, a moment. A man in a black coat stepping off a train in Butte with a piece of paper in his hand and her brother-in-law's name on it. And the look on Samuel Hayes's face when he saw her across the platform. Not the look of a man come to help his dead brother's family, but the look of a man arriving to collect something he'd already decided was his. She'd been running since that afternoon, and now she was lying in a stranger's bed, in a stranger's house, in the middle of a Montana blizzard, listening to her children breathe and trying to decide if Elias Calloway was going to be the thing that saved them or the thing that finished them. He hadn't asked her anything. That was the part she kept turning over. Men who wanted something always asked questions about where you'd come from, where you were going, what you had, what you owed. Elias Calloway had asked her nothing, except how many people were in the lean-to, and that had been for Lily's sake, not his own. She didn't know what to do with that. She fell asleep some time before dawn without meaning to, and when she woke up, the storm had stopped. The silence was the first thing. After hours of the wind pressing against every wall like it was trying to find a way in, the quiet came down like something physical, like the world had exhaled. Gray light moved through the gap under the door. Lily was still asleep, one hand still wrapped around Sunday, the cloth doll's remaining button eye pointing at the ceiling, with the solemn dignity of something that had been through a great deal and was still here. Dorothy got up without waking the children and opened the bedroom door. Elias was at the hearth with his back to her, feeding wood into the fire with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been doing this particular task alone for long enough that it required no thought. He hadn't heard her, or if he had, he gave no sign of it. He just kept working, stack, adjust, the small, careful movements of someone maintaining something that needed maintaining. Dorothy stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before she could stop herself. He was bigger than she'd registered in the dark, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that came not from vanity, but from decades of physical work. The ranch, the land, the daily negotiation between a man's body and the Montana winter. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. His hands, when she'd seen them up close last night, were the hands of someone who had never once in his adult life been able to afford to be careful with them. He didn't look like a threat. She'd learned a long time ago that that meant very little. "Coffee's on the shelf," Elias said without turning around. "Cups beside it." Dorothy crossed to the shelf and poured herself a cup. The coffee was hot and real, and she wrapped both hands around it and felt something in her chest unclench by about a quarter inch, which was as far as she was willing to let it go. "How long have you been up?" she said. "Didn't sleep." "Neither did I." He turned then, looked at her across the room with those dark, still eyes, the look of a man who had been alone long enough that he'd forgotten to pretend at the small social performances most people put on without thinking. No practiced smile, no attempt to seem more comfortable than he was. Just the look itself, direct and unadorned. "Storm broke about an hour ago," he said. "Roads into Harlan Creek will be passable by afternoon." Dorothy held his gaze. "You're telling me we can leave?" "I'm telling you what the roads are doing." She took a sip of the coffee. It was strong enough to do something about the exhaustion behind her eyes, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't intend to show. "We'll go this afternoon, then." "Where?" "That's not your concern, Mr. Calloway." "No," he said, "it's not." He turned back to the fire. "But there's 4 children in the next room who walked through a killing blizzard last night, and the oldest of them hasn't eaten a full meal in as long as I can tell from looking at him. So before you go wherever you're going, let me feed them something that isn't hardtack." Dorothy opened her mouth, closed it. "Fine," she said. The children woke in stages. Caleb first, immediately and completely, the way 7-year-olds wake. One moment unconscious, the next sitting up asking if there were eggs. Nora second, quiet and watchful from the first second, already dressed by the time Dorothy checked on her, already running whatever internal calculation she'd been running the night before. Henry third, and grudgingly, pulling himself upright with the stiff movements of a body that had been pushed past its limits and was now presenting its invoice. And Lily last. Lily woke up the way she always woke up. Slowly, luxuriously, as though sleep were something to be savored rather than escaped. She lay still for a long moment with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling with a kind of interior deliberation that Dorothy had never fully understood, as though her youngest daughter were consulting something before she was willing to commit to the day. Then Lily sat up, looked around the room, located Sunday in the blankets beside her, tucked the doll under her arm, and walked out into the main room in her stocking feet. Elias was at the stove when she appeared. He had a cast-iron pan going and was moving pieces of salt pork around it, with the focused attention of a man who took the task seriously. He heard the small footsteps and glanced over his shoulder. Lily looked at him, then at the pan, then back at him. "You're cooking," she said, with the gravity of a 5-year-old making an important observation. "I am." "Mama cooks." "Mama's drinking her coffee," Elias said. "I figured I'd help." Lily considered this. She crossed the room and stopped about 3 feet from the stove and stood on her toes to see into the pan. "Is that pig?" "Salt pork." "I like pig." She looked at him sideways, the one button-eyed doll held firmly against her ribs. "Sunday likes pig too." "Then Sunday's in luck." Lily smiled. It was the sudden, complete kind of smile that 5-year-olds produce. No build-up, no performance, just the smile arriving at full strength because there was no reason not to. It hit Elias somewhere around the sternum, and he turned back to the pan before it could do anything else. From the doorway, Dorothy watched her youngest daughter standing beside a stranger's stove in her stocking feet, and felt 2 things at exactly the same time. The instinctive pull to go get her, move her back, keep the distance, and something older and tireder than that. The recognition that Lily had never once in her 5 years met a person she wasn't willing to give a fair chance to. And that so far, on the available evidence, Lily's judgment had been better than her own. She stayed in the doorway. Nora appeared at her elbow, quiet as always. She looked at her mother's face first, checking the way Nora always checked, running her own read on Dorothy's expression before she decided what her own should be. Then she looked at Lily and Elias at the stove. "He hasn't done anything wrong," Nora said quietly. "Not yet," Dorothy said. "Not yet isn't the same as something wrong." Nora paused. He caught Henry when he fell last night. Did you see that? Before he even knew who we were, he caught him." Dorothy looked at her 10-year-old daughter. Sometimes she forgot, in the grinding daily work of keeping them all alive and moving, that Nora was watching everything with the same attention Dorothy was, filing it in the same careful way, arriving at her own conclusions through her own methods. It was equal parts comfort and heartbreak that her daughter had been required to become this precise, this young. "I saw," Dorothy said. Breakfast happened around Elias's table in a way that felt both entirely practical and slightly surreal. Elias put food in the center and sat at one end, and nobody said much for the first few minutes, because everyone was eating with the focused sincerity of people who needed it. Caleb ate with both hands and fed Biscuit under the table with the practiced subtlety of a boy who'd been doing it long enough to think nobody noticed. Henry ate slowly and carefully, the way he did everything, like he was conserving something, holding a reserve back just in case. Halfway through the meal, Caleb looked up at Elias with salt pork in both cheeks and said, "Are you a real cowboy?" "Caleb," Dorothy said. "I work cattle," Elias said. "That's close enough, I reckon." "Do you have a horse?" "I have a horse." Caleb's eyes went wide. "What's her name?" "Amos." Caleb stopped chewing. "That's a person name." "Amos seems to feel it suits him." "Amos is a boy?" "Far as I can tell." Caleb turned to Henry with the urgency of someone sharing critical news. "Henry, his horse is named Amos." Henry looked at his brother with the long-suffering patience of a 12-year-old who had absorbed the full weight of the world onto his shoulders and was being asked to care about horse names. He managed it, though. "That's good, Cal," he said, and something in his voice, not warmth exactly, not yet, but the absence of the edge that had been in it since last night, made Dorothy look at him across the table. Henry caught her looking. His jaw tightened, and he looked back at his plate. There it was. The thing she'd been watching for since his father died. The way Henry had taken his grief and his fear and the full, impossible responsibility of being the oldest and welded it all into something hard and protective and self-sufficient, so that now any moment of softness felt to him like a crack in the armor, rather than evidence he didn't need the armor to begin with. She didn't know how to reach him through it. She'd been trying for 2 years. After breakfast, while Dorothy cleaned the plates and Nora dried them, Elias pulled on his coat and his hat and said he was going to check the cattle. He said it to the room generally, not to anyone specifically, and went out without ceremony, the way a man goes out to do a necessary thing. Henry watched the door close behind him. Then Henry stood up and put on the canvas coat that had been his father's, and followed him out. Dorothy turned from the shelf and looked at the closed door. Nora looked at her mother. "Let him go," Nora said. "Nora, Mama, let him go." Dorothy turned back to the shelf. She picked up the next plate and held it without moving for a moment, feeling the cold ceramic against her palms, and thinking about Henry's face at breakfast. The jaw, the eyes, the specific tightness of a boy who was trying to hold something together by refusing to let anyone see the seams. Outside, Henry found Elias at the fence line of the near pasture, checking the rails that the storm had worked at. There were 6 cattle standing in the snow on the far side, thick-coated and patient in the way the cattle are patient with cold, which is philosophically rather than practically. Henry stopped a few feet back and shoved his hands into the coat pockets. He didn't say anything. Elias kept working the fence rail, testing the post, checking where the ice had gotten into the joints. The silence ran on long enough to be a choice on both sides. "You didn't have to follow me out," Elias said. "I know. Cold enough to make it uncomfortable. I've been cold before." Elias looked at him sideways. The boy was standing with his shoulders up around his ears inside the too large coat, chin tucked, watching the cattle with an expression that wasn't about the cattle at all. "Your brother told me your pa said you can tell a man by his woodpile," Elias said. Something moved across Henry's face. There and gone. "Cal says everything," Papa said. "He was too little to know what to keep and what to let go of. So he just kept all of it." A pause. "I don't think that's wrong. I just think it must be easier, being 7. You don't know enough to know what's coming, so you don't have to be afraid of it yet." Elias set down the fence tool and straightened up. He looked out over the pasture where the snow lay over everything in a way that made the land look clean and simple and nothing like itself. "How long since your father died?" 2 years, in March." "And before last night, how long since you'd slept inside a real building?" Henry's jaw worked. "About 4 months." Elias said nothing. He picked up the fence tool and moved to the next post. Henry watched him work. After a while, the boy moved to the other side of the post and put his hands on the rail to hold it while Elias tightened the joint. He didn't ask if it was needed. He just looked at the situation and put himself where he'd be useful. The automatic competence of a child who had been useful so long that it had replaced being a child. They worked the fence line in silence for 20 minutes. Then Henry said, without looking up, "We're running from my uncle." Elias kept working. "Samuel Hayes. He runs a dry goods store in Butte. When Papa died, he said Mama wasn't fit to keep us. Said he had rights under the territorial law. He sent men to the house first, then papers, then—" Henry stopped. His hands tightened on the rail. "He doesn't want us because he loves us. He wants the land Papa left. 40 acres east of Butte, and a water right. That's all it is. 40 acres and a water right. And he's willing to take 4 kids away from their mother to get it." Elias set down the tool. He looked at Henry straight on. The boy was staring at the fence rail with an expression that had nothing to do with fence rails. The look of someone who had been carrying a specific weight for so long that they'd started to confuse the weight with their own body. "Does your mother know you're telling me this?" Elias said. "No." "Why are you telling me?" Henry looked up then. Those gray eyes, too old, too tired, too full of a kind of calculation that should have taken another 20 years to develop. "Because we need help, and Mama won't ask for it. She doesn't trust anybody, and I understand why she doesn't trust anybody. But Lily almost died last night, and we've got nowhere to go. And I'm 12 years old, and I'm trying to keep track of everything, and I can't." His voice cracked hard. He stopped, pressed his mouth shut, looked back at the fence rail. Elias let the silence hold for a moment, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because some things needed the space around them before they could be answered. "You don't have to keep track of everything," Elias said. "Somebody has to." "Not you. Not yet. Not at 12. Henry's jaw tightened. "You don't know what—" "I do know." Elias's voice came out quiet, level. "I had a boy, 5 years old. He never had to know what you know. And I'd give every acre of this land and everything on it to have him back and keep him from ever knowing it." He paused. "That coat your father wore? He put it on your back because he wanted you warm, not because he wanted you to carry his weight in it." Henry stared at the fence rail for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way he was furious about and couldn't stop. He didn't wipe them. He just looked at Elias with wet eyes and a jaw set like iron, defiant about the whole thing, refusing to apologize for being 12 years old and human. "You're not going to tell my mother I said anything," he said. It was not a question. No, Elias said. Henry nodded once. Then he looked at the next fence post down the line. That one looks loose too. Elias picked up the tool. They worked until noon. When they came back inside, Dorothy was sitting at the table with Nora, and Nora was showing her mother something in a small notebook. Pencil drawings, tight and precise, covering both pages. Dorothy looked up when the door opened, and her eyes went to Henry the way they always went to Henry, checking him over, running the quick inventory, cataloging the things she could see and worrying about the ones she couldn't. Henry hung up the coat. He sat down at the table across from his mother and picked up the cup of coffee she pushed toward him without being asked. And for the first time since they'd walked through the door the night before, Dorothy Hayes and her oldest son looked at each other without the full weight of every unsaid thing pressing down between them. It lasted only a second, but Elias saw it from across the room, and he turned away before either of them could notice he had. And he stood at the shelf with his back to the table, and felt the particular ache of watching a family trying to find its way back to itself. The same ache he'd felt every day for 4 years, in a house that had stopped trying. Outside, the snow lay clean and white over everything. The roads to Harlan Creek would be open by afternoon. Dorothy had said they would leave. Elias put a second pot of coffee on and said nothing about it, and waited to see what the afternoon would bring. The afternoon came, and Dorothy didn't leave. She told herself it was practical. The snow on the road to Harlan Creek was passable, but not easy, and Lily had only just come back to full color the night before, and moving 4 children through calf-deep drifts on empty stomachs with a 5-year-old who was still sleeping more than usual. That was a decision made by stubbornness, not sense. She told herself all of that while she stood at the window and watched the road and knew, somewhere underneath the practical reasoning, that it wasn't the road she was weighing. It was the table, the coffee, the way Elias Calloway had come back from the fence line at noon, with her son walking beside him, and the particular quality of the silence between them. Not the silence of 2 strangers with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who had said something real and were still in the middle of deciding what to do with it. Henry hadn't told her what they'd talked about. She hadn't asked, but at lunch he'd eaten a full plate without being prompted, and when Caleb had knocked over his cup and braced for a reaction, Henry had just picked up the cup and put it back without a word, and the relief on Caleb's small face had been so enormous that Dorothy had to look out the window before anyone saw what it did to her eyes. So they stayed the afternoon, and then the afternoon became evening, and Elias put more wood on the fire, and nobody said anything about the road again. The second night was different from the first in all the ways that mattered. The first night had been emergency, the single-minded tunnel of crisis, where there was no room for anything except the next necessary action. The second night had space in it, space for the children to exist as themselves, rather than as people in danger. Caleb discovered that Elias had a set of carved wooden animals on the shelf above the fireplace. 8 of them, horses and cattle, and 1 small bear, and spent an hour arranging and rearranging them across the hearthrug, with Biscuit as an audience, providing quiet narration about where each animal was going and why. Nora sat at the table with her notebook open, drawing in the careful, precise way she drew everything. And when Elias paused near her on his way to the woodpile, she tilted the notebook slightly toward him without looking up. Not showing it exactly, but not hiding it either. The drawing was of the carved bear on the shelf, every detail exact. He said nothing, but he looked at it for 2 full seconds, which Nora clocked the way she clocked everything. And she turned the page and kept drawing. Lily fell asleep on the hearthrug at 7 o'clock, with Sunday tucked under her chin and Biscuit pressed against her back, the dog having transferred its primary loyalty to her sometime during the afternoon, without apparent negotiation. Dorothy draped a blanket over her and sat in the chair beside her and watched her daughter sleep, with the specific expression of a mother who has recently and vividly imagined what it would look like not to be watching her daughter sleep, and is feeling the contrast in every part of herself. Elias sat across the hearth and did not look at Dorothy, looking at Lily. He looked at the fire. He had a piece of tack he was mending in his hands, the familiar work of it, something his hands could do, while the rest of him was occupied with something else entirely. "She named the doll Sunday," Dorothy said. It came out quietly, more to herself than to him. "Robert, my husband. He worked 6 days a week, Mondays through Saturdays. Sunday was the only day he was home all day. He'd carry her on his shoulders and sing those ridiculous songs, and she'd laugh so hard she'd hiccup." A pause. "She was 2 when he died. She barely remembers him. But she named the doll Sunday because I told her that was the day her papa belonged to us." Dorothy's voice stayed even. She had practice keeping it even. "She doesn't know it's a sad name. She just thinks it means the best day." Elias worked the leather in his hands for a moment before he answered. "Maybe she's right," he said. "Maybe it means both things at once." Dorothy looked at him across the hearth. "You do that," she said. "Do what?" "Find the version of things that allows them to be okay." She studied him with those direct blue-green eyes. "Most people either pretend the hard thing isn't hard, or they decide the hard thing is all there is. You seem to find the third option." "I didn't used to," Elias said. "I spent 4 years finding only one option." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, then, "What changed?" He looked up from the tack. Across the room, Henry was in the chair by the window, ostensibly sharpening his belt knife, actually watching the room with the peripheral vigilance that was so constant in him it had probably started to feel like his own pulse. Caleb had fallen asleep beside Lily, one arm draped over the carved wooden bear he'd been playing with, unwilling to put it back on the shelf, even unconscious. "A boy knocked on my door," Elias said. Dorothy held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Lily. They sat like that for a long time, the fire between them, the sleeping children on the floor, the wind outside doing nothing worse than moving through the pine trees in the way wind does when it's finished being dangerous and is just weather again. It was Henry who heard it first. He went still before any of them registered the sound. The particular stillness of a body that has learned to treat the unexpected as threat until proven otherwise. His hand stopped on the knife. His eyes went to the window. "Horse," he said. Elias was on his feet before Henry finished the word. Not rushing, but moving with the deliberate speed of a man who'd spent enough years in situations that required rapid assessment to know the difference between alarm and preparation. He crossed to the window and looked out into the dark. 2 horses, 1 rider, coming up the road from the direction of Harlan Creek at a pace that said purposeful, not casual. Dorothy had risen from her chair. She was standing beside Lily without seeming to have crossed the space between them, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes on Elias's back. "Can you see who it is?" she said. "Not yet." Then, "1 rider. Could be nobody. Could be somebody coming for supplies after the storm. Happens. Or it could be somebody Samuel sent." Elias turned from the window and looked at her. There was no point in offering comfortable alternatives. She knew the map of her own danger better than he did. "Stay inside," he said. "All of you. I'll go out and see who it is." "Elias." She stopped. His name in her mouth, the first time she'd used it, and it clearly surprised her as much as him, because she paused on it. "Be careful." He took his coat off the hook and his hat and went out onto the porch. The rider pulled up at the fence, and Elias recognized him before he dismounted. Will Pratt, who ran the livery stable in Harlan Creek, and was about as close to a neutral party as you could find in a town of 400 people. 50 years old, gray-bearded, with the permanently squinting expression of a man who'd spent 30 years looking at horizons. "Calloway," Will said. He didn't dismount. "Pratt, you're out late for the day after a blizzard?" "I got a reason." Will glanced at the house behind Elias, then back. "Woman and 4 children. You got 'em?" Elias held Will Pratt's gaze without expression. "What's it to you?" "It's nothing to me, personally." Will's voice was level, not threatening, something more complicated than that. "There's a man in town, arrived on the afternoon stage, which tells you something about how determined he is, because the stage nearly didn't run today. Samuel Hayes. Says he's looking for his brother's widow and his brother's children. Says he has legal custody rights under the Territorial Act." Will paused. "He's been talking to Judge Alderman, and he's been talking to anyone in the tavern who'll listen, which is most of them after 2 rounds. Elias kept his face still. "What's he saying?" "Saying the woman's unfit. Saying she's been dragging those kids all over Montana Territory in the cold, with no food and no roof. Saying a man named Calloway has been known to take in strays, and he figures they ended up here." Will shifted in the saddle. "He offered $20 to anyone who could confirm it. And you rode out here in the dark, after a blizzard, for $20, Will." "I rode out here," Will said, and his voice changed, got quieter and more direct, "because Ruth McAllister asked me to. She's been feeding that woman and those kids off and on for 3 months when they passed through town. She says Samuel Hayes is not what he's telling people he is. She says those children are fine, and their mother is a good woman, and she wanted you to know what was coming before it arrived." He paused again. "She also said to tell you that she'll be at the courthouse at 8 in the morning, if it comes to that, and she expects you'll know what that means." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Tell Ruth I understand," he said. Will nodded. He pulled his horse around. Then he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, Calloway, half the town thinks Samuel Hayes smells like a man who's doing arithmetic on other people's lives. Ruth's not the only one." He touched his hat brim and rode back toward Harlan Creek. Elias stood on the porch in the cold until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he went back inside. Dorothy was standing in the middle of the room. She already knew. He could see it in her face. Not surprise. The confirmation of something she'd been waiting for since she woke up in Butte and saw Samuel Hayes on that train platform. The children were all awake now, even Lily, sitting up with Sunday in her lap, looking between the adults with wide, quiet eyes. Henry was on his feet. His hand was at his belt, at the knife, and Elias looked at him once, and Henry's hand dropped. "He's in Harlan Creek," Dorothy said. "Got in this afternoon." "How much time do we have?" "Till morning, probably. He'll want the judge, and he'll want witnesses. He won't come out here in the dark and do it himself. That's not the kind of man he is. He does things with paperwork and other people in front of him." Dorothy's jaw was set the way it set when she was deciding something and had already decided it and was just waiting for the rest of herself to catch up. "Then we go tonight. We go north toward—" "No." Elias said it quietly. "You've been running 8 months, Mrs. Hayes. He's found you every time." "Then what do you suggest?" Her voice had an edge on it, not at him, at the situation. But he was the nearest available surface, and he understood that and didn't take it personally. "I suggest you stop running and start standing." He looked at her steadily. "Ruth McAllister will be at the courthouse at 8. She's not the only one. This town knows what Samuel Hayes is doing, even if it can't prove it yet. You walk into that courthouse tomorrow with people standing beside you and a lawyer who knows the territorial law, and you make him prove his case in front of a judge, instead of making you prove yours in the dark while you're exhausted and freezing. I don't have a lawyer. Harlan Creek has one. Thomas Reed. He does right by people who can't pay, according to Ruth. And according to Ruth, is worth more than her word I've never found any reason to doubt. Elias paused. She also said half the town is already against Samuel. You've got more standing than you think you do. Dorothy looked at him for a long time. Nora was watching her mother's face with that particular focused attention, reading the variables, tracking the decision as it formed. Henry stood near the door with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, doing his own version of the same calculation, with younger and angrier numbers.
If we go to that courthouse,
Dorothy said slowly, and it goes wrong, then we figure out the next step from there. But Dorothy, he hadn't used her name before. It came out differently than he expected it to. Not formal, not careful. Just her name the way names are when you've stopped thinking of someone as a situation and started thinking of them as a person. You can't keep doing this alone. You're one person. He's got money and lawyers and legal language and a judge who's heard his version of the story for a week. You need people behind you. Let me help you get them. Caleb, who had been sitting very still on the hearthrug, in the way children sit still when they know something important is happening and don't want to be sent to another room, looked up at his mother. "Mama," he said, "Mr. Elias helped Lily. And he helped Henry." He said it with the uncomplicated logic of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to distrust simple evidence. "Maybe he can help the rest of us too." Dorothy looked at her son. Then she looked at Elias. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the door of the lean-to the night before, calculating the risk on one side, the risk on the other, the cost of moving against the cost of staying still. And underneath all the calculation was the same thing that had been underneath it the night before. Not trust, not yet, but the recognition of a woman who had run out of options and was being asked, for the first time, to consider that one of the options might actually be safe. "What do we do first?" she said. Elias crossed to the shelf and took down a piece of paper and a pencil. "First, you tell me everything. Every piece of paper Samuel has filed, every legal argument he's made, every reason he's given for why you're unfit. All of it, from the beginning." He sat down at the table and looked at her. "Then I ride to town at first light and talk to Thomas Reed before Samuel Hayes gets to him." Dorothy sat down across from him. Henry unfolded his arms and walked to the table and sat down beside his mother without being asked. Nora sat beside Henry, notebook open, pencil ready, because of course she had dates and details in that notebook, because of course she'd been writing it all down, because Nora Hayes had understood before anyone asked her to that memory was the one thing nobody could take from them if they kept it somewhere safe. "It started in March," Dorothy said. Her voice was steady. She told this story to herself 100 times in the dark, and now she told it to the room, to the man across the table who was writing it down with the focused attention of someone who intended to do something with what he was hearing. "Robert died on a Thursday. Samuel was at our door on the following Monday with papers already drawn up, which tells you he'd had them drawn up before Robert died." Elias wrote. Nora watched his handwriting and cross-referenced it against her own notes, occasionally adding a date or a name in a quiet voice that he incorporated without comment, as though they'd been working together for years rather than hours. Henry said nothing, but he stayed at the table the whole time, and once, when his mother's voice faltered on the part about the night Samuel's men had come to the house in Butte, the part she'd never told the children fully, the part with the broken window and the threats dressed up as concern, Henry's hand moved across the table and covered his mother's and stayed there. Dorothy looked at her son's hand on hers. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Elias kept writing and gave them the moment, which was the best thing he could have done, and probably the least visible thing he did all night, and therefore one of the most important. They worked until midnight. By the end of it, the paper in front of Elias had 2 full sides of notes, and the fire had burned down to the kind of steady red-orange that means it'll hold through the night without tending. The children had gone to bed an hour earlier, Caleb falling asleep mid-sentence about Biscuit, Lily curled around Sunday with her hand in Nora's, Henry in the outside position, facing the door the same way he always slept. Dorothy sat across from Elias in the quiet and looked at the notes he'd made. "Do you think it's enough?" she said. "I think it's a start." He looked up at her. "The law is on his side on paper, but the truth is on yours. And Thomas Reed knows how to use truth in a courtroom better than most men know how to use a gun." He paused. "And Ruth McAllister has a voice in this town that carries further than Samuel Hayes's money, which he's about to find out." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled once, soft and low. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Truly." "Not the answer about your son, which I believe, but that's not all of it. What do you get from this?" Elias looked at the paper in front of him. Then he looked at the bedroom door behind which 4 children were sleeping in his house, safe and warm for the second night. Then he looked at Dorothy Hayes across the table. "I've been getting out of bed every morning for 4 years," he said, "because the alternative was worse, not because I had a reason." He stopped, picked his words with the care of a man who didn't use many of them carelessly. "Your boy walked 3 miles through a killing blizzard because he had a reason. Your daughter names things that don't have names because she believes everything deserves one. Your youngest carries a doll called Sunday because she needs to believe the best day is still coming." He folded the paper. 4 years is a long time to not have a reason, Mrs. Hayes. I'm not doing this for nothing. I'm doing it because for the first time since my son died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. He met her eyes. That's the whole truth of it. Dorothy held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face did what faces do when they've been held very still for a very long time, and finally, carefully, begin to relax. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. "Dorothy," she said. He looked at her. "You called me Dorothy before. You can keep calling me that." Elias nodded once. "Get some sleep, Dorothy. I ride at first light." She stood and crossed to the bedroom. At the door she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. Not with trust exactly, not with the full weight of it, but with something that had the same shape and was getting closer to it by the hour. Then she went in and closed the door. Elias sat alone at the table in the quiet of his house and looked at the notes he'd written. Outside, the wind had gone completely still. The night pressed against the windows, cold and clear, the way Montana nights go clear after a storm has taken everything it came for and moved on. He picked up the pencil. He wrote one more line at the bottom of the page, separate from the legal notes, in smaller letters, the way a person writes something they're not sure they're ready to say out loud. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket, and sat with the dying fire until the first gray showed at the window. And then he stood and put on the coat and the hat and went to saddle Amos before the town of Harlan Creek woke up, and Samuel Hayes had another hour to do his arithmetic on other people's lives. Elias rode into Harlan Creek at 6:30 in the morning, with the cold sitting on his shoulders like something that had decided to stay. Thomas Reed's office was above the feed store on the north end of Main Street, accessible by an outside staircase that was still holding an inch of ice from the storm. Elias tied Amos at the post below and went up anyway. testing each step before he trusted it, and knocked on the door at the top. A long pause. Then the sound of movement, unhurried, the sound of a man who had been awake for a while, but saw no reason to rush on anyone else's schedule. Thomas Reed opened the door in his shirt sleeves, with a coffee cup in one hand and the expression of a man who is not surprised to see someone at his door at 6:30 in the morning, because in 30 years of law in Montana Territory, the people who needed him most always arrived before breakfast. He was 60, spare, with white hair and eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale, clear, with a lot going on beneath the surface. He looked at Elias for a moment. Then he opened the door wider. "You'd better come in," he said. "I've been expecting someone." Elias stepped inside. "Ruth McAllister." "Ruth McAllister," Reed confirmed. He poured a second cup and set it on the desk and sat down behind it. "She came by at 5 this morning, which means she was up at 4 thinking about it, which means she made up her mind last night." He folded his hands on the desk. "Tell me about the family." Elias told him. He put the folded paper from his coat pocket on the desk and went through it point by point. Dorothy's account, Nora's dates, the sequence of events from Robert Hayes's death through Samuel's first papers to the 8 months of pursuit through the Montana winter. Reed listened without interrupting, occasionally picking up the paper and examining Elias's notes with the focused attention of a man sorting wheat from chaff in real time. When Elias finished, Reed was quiet for a moment. "Samuel Hayes filed his petition with Judge Alderman 3 days ago," Reed said. "Before the storm. He's been building his case for a week, which means he had people in this town talking to him before he arrived. Which means he's been preparing this longer than Mrs. Hayes knows." He paused. "Judge Alderman is a fair man, but he's heard one side of this for 7 days. That's a significant head start." "Can we overcome it?" "We can address it. Whether we overcome it depends on the morning." Reed stood and picked up his coat from the hook behind the door. "Is Mrs. Hayes willing to come to the courthouse?" "She is." "And the children?" "The older two, yes. The younger ones are 5 and 7. I'd rather keep them out of it." Reed nodded. "Bring Mrs. Hayes and the older two. The court needs to see her as a mother, not just as a woman on paper. And bring anyone in this town who'll stand up and speak to her character." He paused, buttoning his coat. "How many people has she actually met in Harlem Creek?" "Ruth, Will Pratt, a few others through Ruth." Reed looked at him over the top of his coat buttons. "That may be enough. Ruth McAllister's word in this town carries the weight of 10 ordinary witnesses, and she knows it, and she uses it accordingly." He picked up his hat. "Get your family, Mr. Calloway. Court convenes at 8. Elias rode back hard. Dorothy was dressed when he came through the door, and the children were fed, and Nora had her notebook under her arm, and the look on Dorothy's face when she saw him, the specific quality of it, the way the tension in it shifted from waiting to readiness, told him that she'd spent the 2 hours he was gone making her own decision about this, and had arrived at it on her own terms, which was the only way it would hold. "Reed will take the case," Elias said. Dorothy nodded once. "Then let's go." Henry stood up immediately. He'd already put on the canvas coat, had Nora's extra shawl in his hand to give to her without being asked. He looked at Elias with those gray eyes that never fully stood down and said, "I'm coming." "I know you are," Elias said. Caleb and Lily stayed with Will Pratt's wife, a broad-shouldered woman named Agnes, who had 6 children of her own and the unshakable competence of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what life required of her. Lily went without protest, only after Sunday was introduced to Agnes formally, and Agnes responded with appropriate gravity. Caleb went because Biscuit was allowed inside, which was the only variable that mattered to him. Dorothy watched her youngest two disappear through Agnes Pratt's door and stood on the street for a moment with her eyes closed, the way people close their eyes when they're putting something down that's been too heavy and are not yet sure they should. Then she opened them and looked at the courthouse at the end of Main Street and started walking. The courthouse in Harlan Creek was one room. Wood floors, 6 rows of benches, a raised platform for the judge, 2 tables facing it. Plain as arithmetic. The kind of room that didn't care about impressions and expected the people inside it to come to the same agreement. Ruth McAllister was already there. She was standing at the front of the room with her arms folded and her silver hair pinned up with the precision of a woman who had prepared for this the way soldiers prepare for a known engagement. Thoroughly and without illusion. She was small, barely 5 feet, and she had the kind of presence that made her height irrelevant. Beside her stood Will Pratt, and beside him the school teacher Elias didn't know by name, and 2 ranchers from the east side of the valley, and the woman who ran the dry goods store on 2nd Street, and 4 others whose names Elias was still learning. Ruth looked at Dorothy when she walked in and crossed the room without ceremony and took Dorothy's hands in both of hers. "I know you don't know me well," Ruth said. Her voice was direct, unhurried, the voice of someone who had decided what she was going to say and intended to say it. "But I know enough. I've known women in your position before. I was one of them 30 years ago, before this town decided to stand up for me. Today we stand up for you. That's how it works." She squeezed Dorothy's hands once and let go. "Sit down at the front table. Tom Reed will be here in 2 minutes. Don't let anyone make you feel like you have to explain yourself before the judge says you do." Dorothy looked at Ruth McAllister for a moment with the particular expression of a person encountering something they'd stopped believing existed. Not charity, something more structural than that. The experience of being caught by people who weren't obligated to catch her. "Why?" Dorothy said.
You don't owe me anything. No, Ruth said simply, but I owe it to the version of me that needed someone to show up 30 years ago and didn't have anyone. She stepped aside and gestured to the front table. "Sit down, Mrs. Hayes." Dorothy sat down. Thomas Reed arrived at 5 minutes to 8, with his case files under one arm and his hat already in his hand. He sat beside Dorothy, opened his files on the table, and spoke to her quietly and quickly, walking her through what was coming with the efficient compassion of a man who had prepared clients for difficult mornings 100 times, and knew that the most useful thing he could give them in the last 5 minutes was clarity. Samuel Hayes came in at 2 minutes to 8. Elias had formed a picture of him from Dorothy's account and Henry's, and the man who walked through the courthouse door fit it with depressing accuracy. 50-ish, heavy-set, with red hair going dull, and the kind of face that had been handsome once, in a blunt way, and had settled into something harder with years and whatever had made those years the way they were. He wore a good coat. Not Boston money, but better than the room warranted, which was its own kind of statement. He had a lawyer with him from Butte, younger, with the smooth professional affect of someone who argued cases for income rather than conviction. Samuel's eyes went to Dorothy the moment he entered. Not to the children, not to Reed, not to the crowd filling the benches. To Dorothy. The look was complicated. Elias watched it and thought of what Henry had said at the fence line. "He doesn't want us because he loves us." And thought the boy was mostly right, but not entirely. There was something in Samuel's look that wasn't purely transactional. Something older and more tangled. The look of a man who had told himself a story for 2 years and was now confronted with the story being contested in public, and didn't know which part of him to feel with. Judge Caroline Adler entered at 8 o'clock exactly, and the room stood. She was 50, iron gray,
with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a woman who had learned that rooms settled faster when she didn't rush them. She sat, opened her file, looked at both tables, and then looked at the full benches behind them with an expression that was not surprise, but was something adjacent to it. "This is a fuller house than I expected for a custody matter on the morning after a blizzard," she said. Her voice was dry and carrying. "I'll take that to mean people have opinions. You'll hold those opinions until I ask for them." She looked at the lawyers. "Mr. Reed, Mr. Farrow, let's proceed." Samuel's lawyer, Farrow, went first. He was organized and practiced, and he laid out Samuel's case with the efficient confidence of someone who had read the territorial statutes and found them favorable. Inadequate shelter. No fixed residence for 8 months. Children traveling in dangerous winter conditions with documented insufficient food and clothing. A 4-year-old treated for hypothermia 2 nights prior. A mother with no income, no property, no standing in any established community. Everything he said was true. That was the part that was hardest to sit with. Elias watched Dorothy's face while Farrow spoke, and watched her hold absolutely still under every accurate word. The way you hold still when someone is pressing on something broken, and stopping is not an option. Henry, sitting in the row directly behind his mother, was looking at the floor. His hands were on his knees, and his jaw was working the way it worked when he was deciding something. Nora had her notebook open and was writing dates and corrections in the margin with a pencil in very small letters, her face entirely composed. Then Thomas Reed stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move with the theatrical energy of Farrow's presentation. He simply stood and spoke the way a person speaks when they have something true to say and have learned from long experience that truth doesn't need amplification. "Your Honor," he said, "my colleague has accurately described the circumstances of the last 8 months of Mrs. Hayes's life. What he has not described is how those circumstances came to be." He placed a single sheet of paper on the judge's desk. Robert Hayes died 13 months ago. Within 4 days of his death, Samuel Hayes arrived at his widow's home in Butte with legal papers, papers that had been prepared before his brother's death, according to the notary date on this document, which was 2 weeks prior to Robert Hayes's fatal illness. He paused, letting that settle. Within 3 weeks, Mrs. Hayes had been served with a custody petition. Within 6 weeks, she had been evicted with 4 children from her home when the bank called in the loan Robert had co-signed with his brother. A loan Samuel Hayes had the legal authority to accelerate, and did. Another pause. Mrs. Hayes did not end up living rough in Montana Territory because she is an unfit mother. She ended up there because her brother-in-law systematically removed every stable foundation from under her until there was nothing left to stand on. The room was very quiet. Farrow was on his feet. "Your Honor," "Sit down, Mr. Farrow. You had your time." Judge Adler was looking at the document Reed had placed on her desk. She examined it for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked up at Samuel Hayes directly. "Mr. Hayes, were these papers prepared prior to your brother's death?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "My brother was ill. I was being prudent." "That's not what I asked." A silence. "Yes," Samuel said. The room shifted, not loudly, a shift in breath and posture, the collective physical adjustment of people whose assessment of a situation has just been confirmed. Reed called Dorothy to the stand. She walked up with her shoulders straight and her hands clasped in front of her, and sat in the chair as though she had a right to be there, which was not easy, and which Elias knew cost her something, but which she did because Nora and Henry were watching, and she had never once let her children see her give an inch that didn't need giving. Reed questioned her quietly, and she answered each question with the economy of a woman who had learned not to waste words on people who didn't deserve them. She described Robert's death. She described Samuel's arrival. She described the loan, the eviction, the papers, the 8 months of movement from town to town with 4 children and a dog, and whatever she could carry. She described the lean-to and the blizzard, and Henry walking out into the dark and the cold, because he was 12 years old and his sister was dying, and he did what needed doing. Her voice stayed level through most of it. It broke once, on the part about the lean-to, on the specific moment she'd made the decision to give her coat to Lily, because it was the only warm thing she had, and Lily needed it more. It broke there, and she stopped and pressed her lips together, and then continued. And the room was so quiet you could hear the wood settling in the walls. Farrow's cross-examination was brief and less comfortable than he'd planned, because Thomas Reed had spent 30 years getting comfortable with discomfort on behalf of other people, and it showed in the specific traps he'd laid in Dorothy's testimony that Farrow walked into, twice, before he recognized the architecture of them and sat down. Then Ruth McAllister took the stand. Ruth McAllister on the witness stand was a different proposition from Ruth McAllister in conversation. She sat with the settled authority of someone testifying to things she'd seen with her own eyes and had the receipts for. And she spoke for 12 minutes in the flat, declarative sentences of a woman who had been alive long enough to know the difference between what a person owes the truth and what they owe politeness, and to choose accordingly. She described every time Dorothy and the children had passed through Harlan Creek. She described what she'd seen. She described Dorothy's consistency. Always the children fed first. Always the children warm first. Always the children's needs calculated before her own, with the automatic priority of a woman for whom there was genuinely no other order of operations. She described Lily's trust, and Caleb's laughter, and Nora's seriousness, and Henry's protectiveness, and she described them with such specific detail that the room could see them, could see exactly who these 4 children were, and what kind of woman had made them that way. Then she said the line that Elias would think about for years. "Your Honor," Ruth said, "I have known mothers in this territory for 30 years, rich ones and poor ones and everything between. I have known women with houses and doctors and money who raised children that were cold all the way through. And I have known women with nothing who raised children so full of warmth they lit up every room they walked into." She looked at the judge without blinking. Dorothy Hayes's children are the second kind. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of who their mother is. The room held that for a moment. Then Nora stood up. She stood up from the bench behind her mother, without being called, without Reed asking, without anyone inviting her. She stood up with her notebook in both hands, and she looked at Judge Adler with 10-year-old eyes that had been paying attention since the proceedings began, and said in a clear, carrying voice, "I have dates." The room turned to look at her. Judge Adler looked at her. "Excuse me, young lady." "I have dates," Nora said again, not louder, not softer, with the particular calm of a person who had prepared for this. "Mr. Farrow said we had no fixed residence for 8 months. But we were in Harlan Creek on October the 4th, and November the 17th, and December the 2nd. We were in Billings on September the 9th. We were in Garrison on October the 23rd. She opened the notebook. "I wrote it all down. Where we were, how long, who helped us, what the weather was. I've been writing it down since we left Butte, because Mama said, 'Always remember where you've been.'" She held up the notebook. The courtroom was entirely still. Judge Adler looked at this 10-year-old girl with the notebook and the steady eyes and said, in a voice that had lost some of its judicial distance, "Come here, child." Nora walked to the judge's platform and held up the notebook, and the judge took it and opened it and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Samuel Hayes. Then she looked at Pharaoh. "Mr. Pharaoh," Judge Adler said, "I'm going to take a 15-minute recess. When we return, I would like your client to explain to me why a child was required to maintain her family's whereabouts in a notebook because her mother was afraid of what would happen if she was found." She closed the notebook gently and set it on her desk. "We're in recess." She stood and left the room. Elias watched Samuel Hayes across the aisle. He watched the man sit with the legal machinery he'd built and feel it encountering something it hadn't been built for. Not a better lawyer, not a more powerful argument, but a 10-year-old girl with a notebook full of dates and her mother's handwriting in the margins. Samuel looked up and met Elias's eyes. Elias held the look. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. From behind him, he heard Dorothy's voice, very quiet, talking to Nora, who had returned to the bench.
You didn't have to do that, baby. I know,
Nora said.
I wanted to.
A pause.
Is it okay that I wanted to? It's more than okay,
Dorothy said, and her voice, for the first time since Elias had known her, carried nothing held back in it at all. Henry, beside his mother, put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. Elias turned to face the front of the courtroom and looked at the notebook sitting on the judge's desk and thought about a 10-year-old girl writing down every place her family had been because she'd understood, without being told, that survival required proof. He thought about what kind of mother raised a child to understand that. He thought about what Thomas Reed had said. The truth doesn't need amplification. 15 minutes passed. Judge Adler came back. She sat down and looked at both tables, and then at the room full of Harlan Creek standing behind Dorothy Hayes, and she picked up Nora's notebook and held it for a moment before she spoke. "I've been on this circuit for 11 years, she said, "and I have learned one thing with certainty in that time. You can dress a bad motive in good language for a long time, but you cannot teach a 10-year-old girl to keep a notebook full of fear unless the fear is real." She looked at Samuel Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, I am not going to rule today." Pharaoh was on his feet. "Your Honor, I am not going to rule today because I am ordering a full investigation into the loan acceleration, the eviction, and the preparation of custody papers prior to your client's brother's death. If what Mr. Reed has presented to me is accurate, we are not discussing an unfit mother. We are discussing a systematic legal effort to dispossess a widow of her children for the purpose of acquiring property." She set down the notebook. "You have 7 days to respond to that investigation, Mr. Hayes. In the meantime, custody remains with Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, and she and her children are to remain in Harlan Creek under this court's jurisdiction." She looked at Dorothy. "Mrs. Hayes, do you have a place to stay?" Dorothy looked at Ruth McAllister. Ruth McAllister was already standing. "She has a place," Ruth said, "as long as she needs it." Judge Adler nodded once. "Then we're adjourned." The room broke open with sound. Not chaos, the particular warm noise of people relieved together. The sound of a community that had shown up for something and found out it was worth showing up for. Ruth McAllister was beside Dorothy in 3 steps, with both arms around her. Will Pratt shook Reed's hand. The schoolteacher Elias, still didn't know the name of, put her hand on Henry's shoulder and said something to him that made the boy's expression do something it didn't do often enough. Dorothy stood in the middle of it all and let herself be held by it, and her face, which had been composed and level and absolutely controlled for every minute of the last 2 hours, came entirely apart in the best possible way. Not collapse, release, the specific expression of a person who has been holding a door shut against the wind for so long they've forgotten what it feels like for the door to hold itself. Elias stood at the edge of it and watched and didn't move. This moment wasn't his. He'd helped build it,
but it belonged to her, and he understood that distinction completely. And he stayed where he was, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt since Margaret, that he was only beginning to find words for. Then Dorothy looked across the room and found him. She held his gaze for a long moment, across the noise and the movement and the warmth of the room. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The look said what it needed to say. Not a declaration, not a promise, but the specific acknowledgement of a woman who has been alone in something and has just, for the first time, not been alone in it. Elias nodded once. Dorothy nodded back. And Samuel Hayes walked past them both toward the door, and neither of them looked at him, because he was the arithmetic, and they were the thing arithmetic couldn't calculate, and they both already knew which one was going to outlast the other. The 7 days the judge had ordered stretched into 10, and then into 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, Harlan Creek did what small towns do when they decide someone belongs. It absorbed the Hayes family, the way good soil absorbs water, quietly and completely, until it became difficult to remember a time they hadn't been there. Ruth McAllister gave Dorothy the 2 rooms above her kitchen and refused payment in any form that Dorothy attempted. She was given a sewing kit and a full bolt of fabric on the 2nd day, and a list of orders that needed filling by the end of the month. And Dorothy sat at the table in the back room and worked with the focused gratitude of a woman who understood that the best way to honor what she'd been given was to use it completely. Nora started at the schoolhouse on the Monday after the hearing. She walked in with her notebook under her arm and sat in the 3rd row, and by the end of the 1st week, she had read 2 years ahead of the class, and the teacher, whose name turned out to be Margaret Fowler, had quietly begun leaving harder books on the corner of Nora's desk without comment, a transaction that suited them both perfectly. Caleb made friends with the speed and total confidence of a child who had not yet learned that friendship required anything more complicated than proximity and goodwill. By the end of the 1st week, he had a standing arrangement with the blacksmith's son, involving a half-built rabbit trap and a mutual interest in the structural properties of different types of mud. Biscuit was accepted into this enterprise as a full partner and treated accordingly. Lily told Sunday about all of it every evening before bed, delivering a thorough daily report in the serious, quiet voice she used when she was conveying important information, pausing occasionally to allow for Sunday's response, which she interpreted with complete confidence and relayed to whoever was nearby. And Henry began, slowly and without announcement, to become 12 years old again. It happened in pieces. He slept past 6 on a Tuesday and woke up looking startled about it. He laughed at something Caleb said at dinner. A real laugh, involuntary, the kind that arrives before the person decides to allow it, and then looked briefly embarrassed, and then decided not to be. He came home from school one afternoon with a split lip from a fight he declined to explain except to say that it was handled, and Dorothy's first instinct was to press him, and her second instinct was to let him keep the small sovereignty of having handled something himself. And she went with the second one, and something in Henry's face, when she didn't ask, told her it had been the right call. He still wore the coat, but he'd stopped wearing it like armor. Elias came to town every few days. He came with practical justifications, supplies, Thomas Reed, checking with Will Pratt on the status of the investigation. He always came by Ruth's after. He told himself it was to report to Dorothy on the legal developments. Dorothy told herself she was glad of the updates. Ruth McAllister watched both of them tell themselves these things and said nothing about it, because Ruth McAllister had not survived 62 years in Montana Territory without knowing when to speak and when to let people arrive at things on their own schedule. The investigation moved the way legal investigations move, slowly, with a particular friction of a process designed to be thorough
rather than fast. But Thomas Reed had found 2 more documents with dates that didn't lie, and a clerk in Butte who remembered the loan acceleration and had opinions about it. And by the end of the 3rd week, the shape of Samuel Hayes's case had gone from a wall to a structure with visible gaps in it. Samuel himself had left Harlan Creek on the 3rd day after the hearing. He'd gone back to Butte without speaking to Dorothy or the children or anyone who wasn't his lawyer.
Elias heard about it from Will Pratt and said nothing, and what he felt about it was more complicated than satisfaction, because he'd looked at Samuel Hayes in that courtroom and seen a man who had let grief make him into something and didn't know how to find his way back. And that was a condition Elias understood better than he wished he did. It was on a Thursday evening in the 4th week, with a thaw beginning that turned the snow on the street into a soft gray slush, and the temperature rising by degrees that felt almost personal, that Elias came to Ruth's and found Dorothy alone at the table in the back room. Ruth had taken the children to the church social. Dorothy had stayed behind, saying she had orders to finish. The orders were finished. She was sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of tea and her eyes on the window, where the evening light was doing something complicated with the last of the snow on the rooftop across the street. Elias knocked on the open door. Dorothy looked up. Something in her expression did the small, involuntary thing it had started doing when he arrived. The particular relaxation of a face that has been holding a certain tension and releases it without deciding to. "Samuel withdrew," Elias said. Dorothy went very still. "Reed got the confirmation this afternoon. Full withdrawal. The investigation turned up the original land valuation Robert had filed before his death. Turns out the 40 acres isn't worth what Samuel told the court it was. Once the financial motive collapsed, the case collapsed with it." Elias came in and sat across from her. "It's over. The children are yours. No appeal, no further proceedings. Reed says it's as clean a resolution as he's seen." Dorothy looked at him. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, with those blue-green eyes that had been calculating threat and calibrating trust for 8 months, and were now doing neither. Just looking, the way a person looks when they finally have the room to look without needing the look to accomplish anything except itself. "It's over," she said. "It's over." She set down the cup. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She breathed in once, slowly, and out, and Elias watched her absorb it the same way she'd absorbed everything. Not with collapse, with the quiet, fierce thoroughness of a woman processing a large thing carefully, because she was the only one available to hold it. Then she covered her face with both hands and cried. Not softly, not with the controlled restraint she'd maintained through the courthouse and the weeks of waiting. She cried the way a person cries when they've been not crying for a very long time, and the reason to not cry has finally, entirely, gone away. Her shoulders shook, and the sound she made was the sound of something letting go, of something it had been gripping since before it knew it was gripping. Elias sat across from her and did not tell her it was all right, because she already knew it was going to be all right. That wasn't what the crying was for. He did not move to her immediately, because she needed the space of the crying more than she needed to be held through it. He just stayed where he was and let her have it, and trusted that staying was the thing. After a while the crying slowed, and she took her hands from her face and looked at him across the table with red eyes and cheeks still wet, and the expression of a woman who has just put down something she'd been carrying so long it had started to feel like part of her body. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. I'm not usually—" She stopped, shook her head. "That's not true. I'm usually exactly like this when nobody's watching. I've just been making sure nobody was watching." "I know," Elias said. She looked at him. "I know you know." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, direct and unsentimental about it. That's the strange thing. You see more than you're supposed to, and you don't do anything with it. Most people do something with it. What would I do with it? Use it, to feel like they have something over you, to feel necessary. She looked at him with those direct, clear eyes. You never made me feel like I owed you for seeing me. Elias was quiet for a moment. You don't owe me anything, Dorothy. I know that. She held his gaze. That's what I'm saying. The evening light moved through the window between them. From downstairs came the distant sound of Ruth's kitchen. A pot, a door, the ordinary sounds of a house that was being lived in fully. What do you do now? Elias said. Dorothy turned her cup in her hands. Reed thinks we can file for the land back. Robert's 40 acres.
It'll take time, and it's not certain, but the same documentation that collapsed Samuel's case supports a claim on our behalf. She paused. Even if we get it back, 40 acres in Butte isn't... She stopped. I don't want to go back to Butte. No, Elias said. No. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens between two people who are both aware of what the next thing is and are both waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. Henry found them. He came through the back door with the cold still on his coat and stopped in the doorway when he saw Elias at the table with his mother. He looked between them the way he looked at everything, assessing, calibrating. The 12-year-old who had been the man of the family long enough to have opinions about the men who came near his family. Reed's news got around, Henry said. He was looking at Elias. Will Pratt told me at the livery. I came to tell your mother, Elias said. Henry nodded slowly. He came in and sat down at the end of the table, equidistant between them, which may or may not have been deliberate. He put his hands flat on the table, the same gesture Dorothy had made, which she noticed and which made something move quietly across her face. Mr. Calloway, Henry said. Henry. The boy looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight. I'll do my best. What do you want with us? Henry said it without accusation, without edge, with the level seriousness of someone asking a question they need the actual answer to, and are not asking rhetorically. Not what you've done. I know what you've done. I want to know what you want. Elias looked at this boy, in the dead man's coat, that no longer swallowed him the same way it had the night he'd fallen through the door. He thought about the answer he could give, and the answer that was true, and chose the second one, the way he'd been choosing the second one since the night the storm brought 4 children and a woman to his fence line. I want to get up in the morning for a reason, Elias said. I want to sit at a table where there are people at it. I want to watch you figure out how to be 12 instead of 40. He paused. And I want to ask your mother something. But I want to ask you first, because you're the one who came to my door, and that means you're the one who started all of this, and that earns you the right to weigh in on how it goes. Henry's jaw worked. His gray eyes were steady. What are you going to ask her? Whether she'd consider staying. Harlan Creek. I've got land, a house that's been too quiet for 4 years, and enough cattle work to keep everyone occupied. I'm not asking her to do anything, except think about whether there's something here worth building. He held Henry's gaze. But that's up to her, and I wanted you to know I was going to ask before I asked. Henry was quiet for a long moment. My pa, he said. His voice came out lower than the rest. He was a good man. He was the best man I knew. I don't want anybody thinking I'm saying he wasn't by whatever I say next. Nobody's thinking that, Elias said. He used to say... Henry stopped, cleared his throat. He used to say that a man's job isn't to be needed. It's to be worth needing. He looked at Elias with eyes that were wet at the corners and furious about it and not hiding anymore. "You've been worth needing. Since the first night." He stood up abruptly and pushed his chair in and looked at his mother. "I'm going to go find Caleb." He looked back at Elias. "Sir?" Then he went out the back door, and they heard him on the stairs, and then quiet. Dorothy was looking at the door he'd closed behind him. "He cried," she said softly. "He doesn't do that." "Not where anyone can see." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "That's the first time since Robert died. He needed someone to tell him he was allowed to still be a boy. I've been trying to tell him that for 2 years." "I know," Elias said. "But sometimes it has to come from someone who isn't the person you're trying to be strong for." Dorothy looked at him across the table. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him the first night across the lean-to, calculating, assessing. Except that now the calculation wasn't about threat, and the assessment wasn't about survival. It was something different, something that had been building across 4 weeks of mornings and evenings and practical conversations and silences that had started to hold more than silence usually holds. "Ask me then," she said. Elias leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. He was not a man who made speeches. He did not dress things up in language that was more than the things themselves needed. He had learned, at a cost he would never fully stop paying, that the time for the true thing is now and not later, because later is not guaranteed to anyone, and the people who matter deserve the true thing while you both still have the chance to give and receive it. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "You and Henry and Nora and Caleb and Lily and that dog. I'd like you to stay in Harlan Creek, and I'd like to give you reason to. I'm not asking you to forget Robert. I'm not asking the children to forget their father. I'm asking whether there's room, in what you're building next, for me to be part of it." He held her gaze. "That's all. That's the whole of it." Dorothy Hayes looked at Elias Calloway across a kitchen table in Harlan Creek, Montana Territory, in the early weeks of a spring that was just beginning to mean it. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had been through the specific education of loss and fear and motion, who had learned in the hardest possible way the difference between what holds and what only looks like it holds, who had rebuilt her capacity for trust from the foundation up, and therefore knew exactly what it cost and what it was worth. "My children already think of your ranch as something close to home," she said. "Lily told Sunday last week that the carved horses on your shelf have names, but they haven't told anyone yet." A pause. "Nora has drawn the fence line from 3 different angles in her notebook." Another pause, shorter. "Henry cut wood for your barn last Tuesday and came home like he'd done something he needed to do and hadn't known he needed it until he'd done it." Elias said nothing. He let her come to it. "And I—" She stopped. Breathed once, the way she'd breathed after he told her it was over. Deliberately, making room. "I haven't let myself want anything for myself in 2 years. I've wanted things for them. I've wanted safety and food and warmth and futures for 4 children who deserved all of those things. But I stopped wanting anything that was only mine." She looked at him directly with those clear, direct blue-green eyes. "You make me want something for myself. And I don't know yet whether to be grateful for that or terrified." "Both is fine," Elias said. "Both is honest." The corner of her mouth moved. It was the beginning of a smile, not the full thing yet. The smile was still deciding. But the beginning was there, and it was real. And it was not the smile of a woman managing someone else's comfort. It was the smile of a woman who had arrived somewhere she hadn't expected and found it better than she'd been prepared for. "Yes," Dorothy said. "I'll stay." Spring came to Harlan Creek the way it comes to Montana. Not gradually, but in statements, the snow retreating to the high places, the creek running full and fast and clear, the ground softening underfoot with the smell of it. That particular Montana smell of cold earth opening up towards something. The days lengthened by increments and then suddenly by leaps, and the light that had been flat and white all winter became directional again, full of angles and color, landing on the land with a particular warmth of something returning that had been missed. By April, Dorothy Hayes had more sewing orders than she could fill alone. Ruth McAllister helped on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the two women worked at the big table and talked the way women talk when they're doing something with their hands and don't need to perform the conversation. Directly, about real things, in the shorthand of people who have decided to trust each other. Nora was reading at the level of a 17-year-old, and Margaret Fowler had begun lending her books from her own shelf at home. Novels and histories, and one well-worn volume of poetry that Nora carried everywhere and quoted without attribution, as though the lines had always been hers. Caleb and the blacksmith's son completed the rabbit trap, and it worked on the first deployment, which Caleb received as scientific confirmation of his own genius and celebrated accordingly. Lily named every animal on Elias's ranch, not just the horses and the cattle, the barn cats, the mice she caught sight of in the feed room, two particular crows who came to the fence post every morning. She gave them names with the same gravity and care she gave everything, because Lily Hayes had understood from an early age that naming a thing meant you were paying attention to it, and paying attention was the most important thing you could do for something that was alive. Henry turned 13 in March. On his birthday, Elias took him to the far pasture and showed him the section of fence they'd been working since that first morning. Henry had been helping with it all winter, in the pieces of time between school and chores, and now it ran clean and tight and true for a quarter mile, a thing they'd done together from the posts up. "That's good work," Elias said. Henry looked at the fence. He put his hand on the top rail, the way you put your hand on something you built and want to know if it holds. It held. "I want to learn more," Henry said. "The cattle work, the land, all of it." "There's a lot to learn." "I know." He looked at Elias. "I want to learn it from you." Elias looked at this boy who had been carrying weight too heavy for his shoulders since before he had any business carrying it, who had held his family together by sheer refusal to let it fall apart, who had walked 3 miles through a killing blizzard in his dead father's coat because there was a door somewhere with a light on, and he needed to find it. "Then I'll teach you," Elias said. "All of it, as long as it takes." Henry nodded. He looked at the fence again. Then he looked at the sky, the enormous Montana sky in early spring, with the clouds moving fast and the light changing every few minutes, the way it does when the weather is still making up its mind. "My pa would have liked you," Henry said. "I think about that sometimes. I think he would have said, 'You're a man worth knowing.'" He paused. "I wanted you to know I think that." Elias stood beside this boy at the fence they'd built and felt the weight of that. The specific, irreplaceable weight of being told by someone whose opinion cost them something that they think you're worth the cost. "Thank you, Henry," he said. The wedding was in May, on a Saturday with the sky cleared after 2 days of rain and the air smelling of everything new. Reverend Aldous Cole performed the ceremony in the church on the north end of Main Street, with the windows open because the day was warm enough to allow it, and nobody wanted to waste it. Ruth McAllister sat in the front row between Nora and Caleb and cried from the opening prayer through the final blessing, without any particular embarrassment about it. Lily was the one who carried Sunday down the aisle, because Lily had decided that Sunday should be present at the most important day, since Sunday was named for important days. Nobody argued with this. Dorothy had long since learned that arguing with Lily about matters of ceremony was a poor investment of energy. Henry walked his mother down the aisle. He was 3 inches taller than he'd been in December, and the canvas coat had finally, genuinely, come close to fitting him. He walked with his shoulders back and his head up and his eyes straight ahead, and he did not cry, which was a choice he was entitled to make. But when Dorothy took Elias's hand at the altar and turned to smile at her oldest son, Henry's jaw worked exactly once, and he looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people look at ceilings when they are deciding on behalf of something. And then he looked back and nodded, a single nod that meant everything it needed to mean. Caleb cried openly and without any concern about it, which was deeply on brand, and which made half the congregation laugh and the other half cry in sympathy.
After the ceremony, after the food and the noise and the particular warm chaos of a town celebrating itself through two people it had decided to claim as its own, after Ruth McAllister danced with Will Pratt and Nora sat with Margaret Fowler, talking about books in a corner with the focused pleasure of people discussing things they love, after Caleb and Biscuit had been fed more than was probably advisable and had fallen asleep under a table, after all of it, Elias and Dorothy sat on the steps of Ruth's porch in the late May evening and watched the last of the light leave the sky. Lily came out and climbed into Elias's lap with Sunday under her arm, and leaned her head against his chest and looked at the sky with a contemplative seriousness that was her natural state at the end of a long and significant day. After a while, she said, "Papa Jake." Elias looked down at her. Are you happy now?" He looked at the evening sky. He looked at Dorothy beside him, with her shoulder against his, her hands folded in her lap, her face open and unguarded in the way it had become over these months, not undefended, just freely inhabited by itself, without the armor. He looked at the street where Henry was walking with Thomas Reed's son, talking with his hands, the way he talked when he forgot to be careful. He looked at the warm light in Ruth's window and the sound of Nora's voice carrying through it. He thought about Margaret. He thought about Thomas. He thought about the winter of 1879 and the 4 years of sitting in a dark house, counting the ways he had failed the people he'd loved. And the night in December, when a boy had pounded on his door in a killing blizzard because he had nowhere else to go. "Yes," Elias said. "I'm happy." Lily nodded, satisfied. She tucked Sunday more firmly under her arm and closed her eyes. "Good," she said. "I told Sunday you would be." She wasn't sure, but I told her. A pause, right at the edge of sleep. I said, "Some people just need someone to open the door." She was asleep in under a minute. Dorothy looked at her daughter, sleeping in Elias's arms, and then looked at Elias, and they held each other's gaze in the soft May dark. And what passed between them in that look was not the beginning of anything. It was the confirmation of something that had already been true for a long time. Something that had been built not in one moment, but in 100 small ones, in cold mornings and fence lines and courthouse benches and kitchen tables, and the particular grace of two people who had each lost the ones they loved, and had found, in the ruins of that loss, the extraordinary and unearned gift of being asked to love again. A boy had walked 3 miles through a killing blizzard in his dead father's coat because 4 children needed a door to open. The door had opened, and everything that mattered had walked through it.